Hey, somebody needs to fertilize the grid orchard. You have? Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. You are listening to the Professional Noticer. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Andrews. Hey, thank you for making me a part of your week. My purpose here today and with every show we do is to play the part of a best friend or coach. I want to help you live the life of your wildest dreams by giving you access to the greatest mentors the world has to offer today. The Professional Noticer sponsored this week by our great friends at Tucker ATV. You should see the variety of power sport products at Tucker ATV. It'll blow your mind. Hustler turf equipment, the entire line of Echo power tools, and of course Tucker ATV carries every make and model of Polaris ATVs, the little ones and the big ones. And you have to see the showroom, the taxidermy, the antique displays, and an indoor porch with its porch swing, its comfortable chairs, the television, and free coffee. Stop in and meet Shannon and Lisa Tucker. They treat customers like family, which is why folks from 14 states have done business with Tucker ATV. Highway 43 North in Jackson, Alabama. Tucker ATV, the small town business with a national reputation. Observations and answers, that's what we do here on the Professional Noticer. And as you know, we love it when somebody comes to the table with both. We can have a guest that has brilliant observations and awesome answers. It's just like hitting the lottery, and that's what we've done today. We have a guy that you definitely need to know. He is best known probably as a CEO, but he is kind of one of a kind. I mean, this is a guy who has come from a place that you will appreciate because he credits his grandfather with a lot of his success, and then grew up, went to college, got involved in some special studies to find that success was more a matter of the brain and more a matter of neuroscience than anybody ever thought. So please welcome the CEO of Braintrust, Jeff Bloomfield. Jeff, how are you doing?
Andy, I'm doing great. It's my pleasure and privilege to be on with you and your audience. So thank you.
Man, I know you and your family are busy this time of year, and so I appreciate you coming on. And you're not just busy with Christmas. You've turned your success into a servants organization. If you would, just maybe right off the beginning, tell us about your work with the orphans and how that came about.
Wow. Okay, we're going to start there. Let's go empathic.
I want to start there because I think most people would take that as an afterthought and say, okay, how did you start? Tell me about your papa. Tell me about this. How did you figure out the neuroscience stuff? Now you've used your success but I want to show people right off the bat, what an end result is. I mean, so how did you find this? And then we're going to go back to the neuroscience.
Yeah, I love it. Let's jump in. Let's jump in a few of the different later chapters. And I think, so to tell the story, my wife and I, after we got married, we got pregnant really, really early with my daughter, my oldest daughter, Grace, just like a textbook, right? Just like you plan it out, you get married, you're pregnant right away. You got this beautiful daughter. 3 months after she was born, I was diagnosed with testicular cancer. In fact, I don't think I've ever shared that, publicly on a podcast before. And so it kind of hit me pretty hard, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And we had a difficult time having any more children. We prayed through it, and we really felt like, we were going to have more kids, and went through some help with our son. We got help with our son, and we had him through in vitro, and we had our son 4 years later. And that was kind of, we're kind of tapped out there. Okay, we got a daughter and a son. I'm feeling good, and God's blessed us, and we want to just keep this going forward. And then my wife had this just continual nagging in her heart that we were supposed to do more, and we just, as faith-based people, believe we're supposed to take care of the widows and the orphans. And as things were kind of evolving, I tell people that, God told her way before he told me that we were going to adopt.
Right.
And
yeah, I've often wished God could tell my wife and I the same thing at the same time. I think it would make life a lot easier.
Wouldn't it though? But I think he has a sense of humor, so he likes to see the juxtaplay, what's happening, the juxtaposition, what's happening in relationships down there. So anyways, so we go through this process, and we had good friends who had adopted from China, and my sister-in-law, all three of her boys are adopted domestically. So we were big proponents and supporters of adoption and foster care. We just believe that that's such a need in our culture and society.
Right.
But I wasn't feeling called to adopt from China, but we were feeling called to adopt internationally because there's a lot of support here in the United States for domestic adoptions. One of my very first clients was a gentleman from India. And I got to know the Indian culture really well. I got to be friends with them. And really what started to tug on my heart a little bit was that when I learned there was 30 million orphans in India alone. Think about that, 30 million just in India. And less than a third of them, I believe, are actually in orphanages. They live on the streets. And so my heart just started breaking. And so that was kind of the tipping point for me. I told my wife, I'm like, hey, I think I'm in on this adoption thing, but I think it's got to be India. And she's like, okay. She's like, I don't care. You tell me where, and we'll go make it happen. So where this story takes a really interesting turn is we said we would adopt any child that needed medical needs. It took us a long time. There's a lot of political nonsense in this. It's so heartbreaking how hard it is to adopt a child, especially internationally, how expensive it is. So we finally get a match. And I'll never forget, Andy, I was driving in my pickup truck, and this isn't the start of a country song. This is actually real life. I was driving in my pickup truck, and my wife calls me and says, hey, we got a match. And I said, oh, that's great. And she's like, I don't think it's what you were expecting. And I said, okay, well, what do you mean? She's like, I'm going to send you over the picture. So she sends me the picture, and there's a picture of this little child, doesn't look more than 2 years old, and her head's tilted way back, her head shaved. She's in what looks to be a very impoverished, desolate playground. And I said, what's going on? What's wrong with her? And she's like, well, she's got something wrong with her eyes. She was born with an eye condition. So her eyelids wouldn't open. So she really couldn't see. She was looking out of two slits in her eyes. And I immediately felt that leap in my spirit. And I said, I got to call you back. And I pulled over and I hung up. A few times in my life, I felt like I had the audible voice of God. That was one of them. In the truck that day, he said, that's her. I said, okay. I called my wife back. I'm like, it's her. She's like, are you sure? I'm like, I don't know why, but it's her. I'm sure. So she put in and said, okay, we're going to do some research, find out what's going on. And this is where I'll fast forward to the punchline here. So she had a condition called ptosis, where you're born without eyelid muscles. It's a fairly common condition, but most of the time in the United States, they recognize it at birth. They try to correct it as an infant. Off you go. Well, she didn't have that luxury. So we started studying what is ptosis, how do you correct it? And it turns out that the physician, the surgeon that invented the procedure to correct it, 20 miles from our house in Cincinnati, Ohio, he wrote the textbook on how to correct this procedure for this little girl that we just agreed to adopt on the other side of the world. And so I sat there, I just started crying. I'm like, I don't know what your faith perspective is in this life, but if you don't believe there's a God after hearing hope, it's been now 7.5 years ago, a little over 7 years ago. She's 9. She's the delight, apple of our eye, amazing third member of our children, of our family. She's just tremendous. So
what's her name?
We really believe that that's Priya Hope.
Priya. Wow.
That's a whole nother story. My wife and daughter had a whole nother name picked out for her. When we got to the orphanage in this remote area in India, the nun looked at her and said, we named her Priya. They dropped her off here when she was a month old. And we named her Priya because that means God's love. And I said, well, we can't change her name.
Yeah,
we're not changing that.
Yeah, not going to change that. Now, how did your experience with Priya fold into you doing work with this?
Well, we've always wanted to support that. In fact, we're still now feeling like we're praying through how do we continue to support adoption more, and how do we figure out a way to help families get resources to get adoption more? How do we? Because when we were over there, we had resources. We've been blessed. The business had been blessed, so I could afford to pay for us to go international, and we could afford to actually have a guide there to help us navigate the Indian government, or we'd still be there. It was insane. And we watched other families going through this process who didn't have that. And it's just a shame. So we're trying to continually figure out ways to help that process, be it domestic or international, because it's such a need.
Well, man, you have you and your family both. I mean, I'm so glad you're blessed with Priya, but that has been an impetus for doing so many things for so many people. So back to the beginning now. Wouldn't Papa be proud of you?
I like to think so. I would hope so.
Tell me about your beginnings on that farm.
Yeah, so my papaw was born and raised in Kentucky, and blue collar from the holler, as we like to say, and he was a medic in World War II, and really had not much more than a couple nickels to his name, and decided that he wanted a different life for the family. So he packed up everything he had, and my grandmother, and it was at the time just my aunt and my dad. They were babies, and he moved up to Mansfield, Ohio, and he bought a farm up there with his life savings. And he worked third shift as a maintenance supervisor in a steel mill, and then he farmed during the day. And I was attached to his hip when I was born. He was my guy. He taught me how to drive when I was 5, standing between his knees on our old green John Deere tractor. And I just think of all these papawisms that I picked up on from him. Problem solvers rule the world, and hard work and perseverance. And we have the platinum rule, which treat other people better than they expected to be treated. And all these, he had an 8th grade education. But the thing I remember the most about him was he was such a patient teacher. He was a storyteller, but he was a teacher, and he would rarely give you the answer. He kept asking you questions. And so he trained into me how to be a creative problem solver, how to be a kind of a strategic problem solver, and to keep thinking about alternative answers. And so I kind of grew up with this. My dad was the opposite of that. He was a Vietnam vet Marine, post-traumatic stress syndrome, violent, abusive guy. We didn't have the same relationship. So I gravitated to my papaw. But unfortunately for me, on February 2nd, 1982, I got off the school bus to see him. And every day before, it's a 50-yard long gravel driveway with a green Chevy Silverado at the end of it. And that's what it was every day as long as I can remember. But on February 2nd, 1982, it was full of cars. And I got off the school bus. I headed down to see him, and an ambulance followed me down. And I didn't know it at the time. They took him out on a stretcher, but he had stage 4 lung cancer. And that would be the last day that I'd ever get to see him alive. And Andy, I was devastated. But like you think about your life and your journey, and like your journey, right? You've got a lot of things happen to you that have propelled you in a direction. And that was a moment for me. That was a moment for me where I knew that he wanted me to be the first person in our blue collar family to go to college. I just thought, honestly, I'd probably grow up and run the farm.
How old were you?
I was in junior high. Yeah. So 13.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm sure that somewhere deep inside him, he was aware of what he was sowing in you, and it's amazing to see when that happens, how that works, because that's what a legacy he has left, and that he still has going on through you.
I like to think, a lot of people use this analogy, but it's that ripple effect, right? Every decision we make has a ripple effect. And whether you do it intentionally or not, every decision you make has a ripple effect. And he made an intentional decision to move the family from Kentucky, where there really wasn't anything. It really was a very poor area, coal miners and railroad workers and farmers, and there wasn't much there. And he made a conscious decision to drop that pebble in that lake and move up where he thought there would be more opportunity. I wasn't even born then.
Right.
He just had a vision for what was to come, I think. And then when I was born, I was the apple of his eye. And he really, I to this day, I wouldn't be even a quarter of the guy I am without him.
Hey, just kind of a little aside here, some interesting trivia for you. I may get killed for saying this aloud on a public broadcasting thing, but Nick Saban, his what his grandchildren call him? Papaw.
Papaw.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Nick is a papaw. So which I can't believe now. I'm talking more about it, but every time I see him, that's what I want to say. Papaw, but
right.
I don't. So what did you study in college? What started you on the road that you're on?
Yeah, so I have a business degree. So I studied business, and to be honest with you, I didn't know what I wanted to be. I knew I was really fascinated about business and about people. I had a love for science, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't want to be a doctor, and I didn't want to go be some biologist. I didn't have that kind of drive, but I loved and was fascinated with the mechanics of business, and really even again back to the farm. I loved that we would buy. We'd buy grain, we would buy product, and I'd watch my papaw negotiate from seeds to cattle, and then we'd take them and we'd do something with them, and then we'd take them to market and we'd sell it, whether it be the crops or whether it be the cattle. I loved margin. I loved learning at a young age because a farm is a small business. Well, nowadays a lot of them are big businesses, right? But I was always fascinated by that. So I went and got a degree, and I got a degree in business. I gravitated toward marketing because marketing was the closest thing to storytelling that I could find in school that had a storytelling or a communication aspect to it. And that's where I kind of jumped off. But I also had the opportunity to go into biotech. So here's where things get fun is, so my papaw dies of lung cancer. I get to go to work for a company in the biotech world where I got to work on the sales and marketing team to commercialize a drug for lung cancer. And so you can start to see again these billboards. I call them billboards. God puts these billboards up along the highway, and if you pay attention, you'll see them. If you're paying attention, you don't see them, then you probably got off the wrong exit somewhere and you're on the wrong road. Right. So I start to see these billboards where I'm helping. I'm really passionate because papaw died of lung cancer. I'm helping commercialize this drug for lung cancer. It's giving people an extra year of life who have lung cancer. So when I'm out talking to doctors about this, I'm telling stories, right? I'm communicating, I'm teaching, I'm talking about the little kid out in the lobby who's I just walked past, whose grandfather, without our drug, is going to have 3 months to live. Well, with it, he'll make it through Christmas. And so I'm telling these stories about how these physicians can help these families get more time with their papaws. And of course, my numbers are through the roof because everybody they like to be taught that way. I don't know why. I just know that I'm passionate about it. I communicate the way papaw did. I kept getting promoted, and everybody scratched their head and said, we don't get how this storytelling farm kid from Ohio keeps getting promoted, but yeah, we like listening to him. So carry on. And
when did you start seeing the patterns? Because obviously what you were doing was communicating on a different level. Yeah. And so when did you start seeing the patterns between what you were doing maybe and what other people are, good and bad communication? I've said for a long time, watching corporations and politicians and preachers and entertainers, that the biggest disasters that I have seen have not been disasters of judgment. They've been disasters of communication. And so when did you start noticing the ebb and flow of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we say it here all the time that the number one determining success or failure factor of any individual or any organization is their ability or inability to communicate effectively. I can trace every root cause, either success or failure, back to some form of either successful or failure in communication. So I completely agree with you. So I'd gotten promoted way above my capabilities and as a divisional area manager where I'm leading people now. I actually have other humans I'm responsible for. And so I was always fascinated with speakers, from Tony Robbins to, fill in the blank. I always loved speakers. And I loved, when I go to church, I loved when I'd listen to somebody who was compelling. But as a manager, and I have a voice now, I always had a voice, but didn't think I had a voice. But as a manager, you have a positional voice. I started to recognize that as I'm around other managers and other leaders, man, when John talks, I just want to shove pencils in my eyes. But, when Larry... Right. But when Larry talks, I'm leaning forward and I'm all in. And I started recognizing, what is it about the way that they're communicating that has my interest? And again, I didn't know exactly what it was, but I kept tracing this back to papaw. I'm like, well, they're telling stories, or they're using analogies or metaphors, or they're using, props, and they're pulling you in and they're evoking emotion and all this thing. I'm like, well, there's got to be more to this. And lo and behold, I got promoted, and they asked me if I would build a team to launch a new drug for brain cancer. And so I'm like, that's a pretty big deal, right? This is kind of heavy. And so I take the job, and we start building the team, and we start talking to our neuro researchers, neurobiologists, and neuroscientists. And technology had advanced so fast, functional MRI and EEG, and we're looking at the brain in real time, but we were looking at it through the lens of how does this drug impact the blood-brain barrier relative to glioblastoma, right? So that's what we're looking at it for. But the more I'm looking at the technology and I'm talking to these neurobiologists, I'm like, wait a minute, we're literally mapping the brain in real time based on how it's interacting with the drug, but it's also changing based on what's happening with external stimuli. So why can't we just use that same technology to tell how people respond to communication? And this scientist, I'll never forget, the scientist looks at me and goes, well, why would you want to do that? I said, what do you mean, why would you want to do that? Because 99.9% of the world has to communicate for a living. Wouldn't it be great to know that if you say this, it activates this part of the brain? And now that we can map the brain and understand what areas of the brain are responsible for things like building trust and creating urgency to change and all those things. And that's when it happened. The light bulb went off, and I'll never forget. I was sitting on the 16th floor of our office building in San Francisco, overlooking the bay, when it hit me. Like, this is my purpose. It was like Papal meets neuroscience, all came together in that moment. And I said, I believe I can take the biology, the physiology, and the psychology of communication, blend them together, and go out and teach them in a way that's simple and easy to understand, so people can go from winging it, communicating intuitively, to being more intentional about the way they communicate, but not based on opinion, based on how God designed our brains to work. And so that was the impetus 11 years ago for me to really start Braintrust. And that's kind of what kicked this off.
Tell me the name of your latest book.
Latest book's called Neuroselling. And we wrote it for sales organizations and for small business owners and big companies as far as how to communicate to customers. Okay,
well, I'm going to tell you the name of your book that's going to sell millions.
Lay it on me.
Papal meets Neuroscience. Effective communication for the masses.
I love it. Hey, you know what? Here we go. I'm writing that down. I'm
telling you, when you said that, I thought I would pick up Papal meets Neuroscience. I mean, figure out your subtitle, but Papal meets Neuroscience, that's killer.
I love it. Well, it's funny because I like that better now than I said one day, when I'm Andy Andrews, I'm going to write my last book. It said everything I needed to know in life I learned on the farm, but I think I like this better.
Papal meets Neuroscience. There's nothing like that.
We might have to take this one offline, won't we? We're going to talk about this one.
Yeah, I get that title locked up fast. So, yep. I listened to you talk about seeing the difference in how people communicate and understanding that somebody's communicating with stories. And I think about growing up like I did. My dad was a minister of music, and so I grew up in church all the time and heard more sermons than most people will hear in their lifetime, I suppose. But my wife jokes and says that I'm cursed to remember everything I've ever heard in my life. And I see why she says that, because I can remember the words to songs and I remember every joke I ever heard. But I know that that's not totally true, because I can't remember all the sermons that I heard. However, I can go back to 5 and 6 years old, and I could just sit here for hours and tell you sermon illustrations, because I was like every other kid. I'm playing with a pencil and the bulletin and drawing pictures, and most of the sermon when I was growing up, to me, sounded like Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 wah. But every now and then it would break in with wah, 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 wah. It's like this guy was walking downtown one day, and I'd be in on that. And then when the story ended, it's back to wah, 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 wah. It's like two guys were fishing together, and I'm in. And I can remember all those stories,
Yep.
but I can't remember the other stuff. So it's amazing how that stuck.
Yeah, and we've been able to identify how that's possible now. Like our working memory, I don't want to go nerd city on everybody here, but one of the simple ways to think about the brain is not, some people have heard of left brain, right brain, and yes, that's real. But the recent research the last decade is there's two networks in the brain. There's an analytical network, and then there's the emotional empathic network. And what we've learned through the science is
I also have a Cartoon Network in mind, but go ahead.
you do. You have a third layer. It's called the Cartoon Network. That's awesome. Anyway, the point on it is that our long-term memories reside mostly in our emotional empathic network. So your analytical network is that kind of computer, CPU. Your working memories there, and your analytical evaluation, control. All your comparison analysis. It's your calculator brain, right? Whereas your emotional empathic brain, when you bypass that analytical network, you activate the emotional empathic brain. And so internal visualization, so when you story tell and someone can imagine something, that's happening there. Your long-term memories, that's happening there. And your emotions, that's emanating there. So when you wire those three elements together, you almost instantaneously create a new neural pathway that's a long-term memory that's easier for you to access. That's why storytelling's so amazing. It bypasses that analytical part of our mind, everybody's analytical part of their mind, and causes them to tap into that emotional empathic network.
Yeah, I'm curious as to how you would answer this, but who are some of your favorite authors? Just people that you like to read their work. Who?
Well, one of my favorites is this guy. His name's Andrew Andrews. Andy Andrews.
Okay.
I don't know if you've
heard.
heard.
All right. Yeah, you're very kind. Now, tell me the real answers.
Well, it's almost like I'll tell you what my 17-year-old son asked me the other day. Dad, what's your top 5 favorite movies? I'm like, yes, you can't answer that question. You gotta ask it almost by genre, right? So when you think about favorite authors, I like reading a lot of what I'll call narrative-based science work. So, people like Dan Pink, I think, do a really nice job of taking a scientific approach and they apply some storytelling to it.
Okay, now wait. Here, let me ask this in a deeper way. When you're on your own and you're not feeling like you need to learn something, or you're not feeling like you need to research something, or what do you pick up to read? Who are those authors?
You're going to expose me. That's what's happening right now.
Well, I want to see the storytellers that are compelling to you.
Yeah, and this is the honest truth. I can't turn my brain off from learning. I don't read for entertainment. I don't read a single book that's entertainment based. I haven't read one for 20 years. So I'll pick if I'm going to read the Traveler's Gift, I'm going to read it because I know that there's allegories in there that are going to pique my brain and cause me to get new ideas about something. So I'll pick up Tony Robbins' latest book. I'll pick up a book from Dave Ramsey, but then I'll also pick up a book from Daniel Kahneman, who's a neuro researcher, behavioral economist. Those are the kind of things I pick up, because if I'm going to spend the time using this brain to read something new, I want something that's going to provoke creativity in me and cause me to be able to add more value back out. So I do not read for entertainment. I just don't. So judge me all you want. It's fine.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. Because I kind of, and I'm not in public disagreement with you or anything, because this has obviously worked for you, and I'm always curious about what works for somebody and how do they think and how do they decide. And maybe it's because I'm so ADD, but I have a real passion for learning, but I still have to make myself do it. And so I feel like I read a combination of nonfiction and fiction. And the reason, and I don't know if this is right or wrong. In fact, you could probably tell me if this is right or wrong, but my reasoning in myself is that I read the nonfiction for facts, and I read the fiction to fire my imagination in a way that the facts don't, don't. And I feel like that if I only know the facts in the same way that everybody else knows the facts, but I don't develop my imagination to either understand or present those facts in a different way, then I'm kind of on the same plane. And I suppose that's why I do what I do in stories. I know you and I are closely aligned on the importance of stories. And I've never really considered myself a scholar, but I look at you, and it's hard to consider you anything but a scholar. Your area of study and what you've turned it into is just fascinating.
Yes, but and I say yes, but nobody really cares about how much I know about the brain. Like, they can we just be honest? Like,
Well,
they don't.
They don't care until it affects them, and maybe that's my point. Is you do know a lot about it, and so how do you deliver that subject? And I think, you and I talked before going on the air about soon to be mutual friends of ours, Bob McEwen and Jimmy Yeary. And I think, Bob McEwen is way smarter than I am. Jimmy's way smarter than I am. And yet these guys have learned to communicate differently, but both communicate with stories. I think I think I'm going to enjoy watching your interviews with them, because I think I'm going to learn a lot.
Yeah, well, that's for me, the learning part. We're the same. Like, we both have an insatiable desire to learn. And, for me, we've got multiple studios in here, and I've read every book on these, from Made to Stick. Then there's John Maxwell, Good to Great. I mean, these are kind of business books that I learned from. I like business books that are story driven, allegory driven, and I constantly pursue those things. So what you do is you read fiction to activate the elements of your imagination that help you stay tied to the creativity that you are so well known for. What I do with that is I do music, which we both do that as well. So I like to write music, and I like to, because it activates that creative part of my brain. I like to listen to music to dissect the stories, which is why I love songwriters like Jimmy so much. I mean, when you open up and say 89 cents in the ashtray, half a bottle of Gatorade rolling on the floorboard, Dirty Braves cap on the dash, you immediately bypass my analytical network and you activate the visual core, the internal visualization network in my brain. And Ohio State did a study on this. I'll really nerd out. And it's called transportation. When you storytell, either in the written word, the spoken word, or through music, you literally transport the listener's brain into that visual. And at that moment, it's now their story, even though you're the one communicating it. So they own it now. So the minute I'm in that pickup truck, that when Jimmy writes about with I Drive Your Truck, the very first line of that song, and why I think it was such a powerful hit, is you immediately activated two things. And he and I'll get into this next week. He immediately activated my visual center and my curiosity, because I didn't know where the story was going. So there's lots of elements to why communicating that way totally pulls the human brain in, because it doesn't want to be given a bunch of facts. It just doesn't, because that takes too much. There's a lot of calorie and horsepower to process the data, where the visuals and the stories, they're easier in our minds work to, from a work horsepower standpoint.
Right. What, and I know I'm running on overtime here now, but I got one more question I want to ask you, and that is, you seem to me, well, let me put it this way. You and I seem a lot alike. I see a lot of authors and speakers that they got a hold of something years ago, and they're continuing to do just another version of that same thing they got a hold of. And yet you seem to be bearing down and really learning and expanding what you're learning. So what recent stuff? What have you what's been aha moments for you in the fairly recent future or fairly recent present that has something that helps people that you think people would be curious about?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's all kind of seems like it's culminating together, and it still does revolve around communication. And I take this from my own personal life, right? And as I reflect back on my parenting style as a father, and I reflect on my ability to be a husband and the conflict that I've had in both of those over the 23 years of my marriage, and my daughter's 22, and I look at those things and I think, where did I miss the science in my own life as a communicator, and how do we help create pathways, programs, simple to understand principles for people to recognize situationally in the moment how to take, in emotional intelligence work now, it talks about that self-awareness and then that self-regulation. How do we help people every day have quick and instinctive almost awareness of what they're feeling, and then the ability to control that emotion so they can become a more empathic communicator? Like I feel like the next chapter of my life is really situational communication effectiveness in relationships. My why, my purpose now is to help people improve their relationships by being better communicators. Oh, and by the way, I want to live my life that one day my kids use me as the sage in their story like I do my papaw. Like, those are my two things, right? But for me, that's it. Can we help improve relationships by teaching people simple principles that they will recognize in the moment that'll help them be a more effective communicator? That's it. That's where we're going.
That's awesome. Well, man, we will have all your connections on the show notes, and really, really appreciate you taking the time to be with us, Jeff. And I want to make sure that I'm getting your podcast, because I really want to see these next ones you got coming out. And so thank you for spending your time with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And for your audience, thank you. You were on our podcast not too long ago, and it was such an honor to have you on. And I think that, again, you and I are a billboard. Now, what are we supposed to do with it? We'll figure that out as we go along. But this is, I think, the beginning of an awesome friendship. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Let's keep in touch. Ladies and gentlemen, future author of Papaw and Neuroscience, Jeff Bloomfield. Thank you, buddy.
My pleasure.
I'm Andy Andrews, the professional noticer, harnessing common sense and wisdom to plow through challenges all the way to an answer for you. And I think that'll do it for this week. Get us out of here, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to the boys and girls who aspire to become ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of another episode of the Professional Noticer. In a world where common sense has become a superpower, I'm harnessing that tiny bit of mental energy I have for you, seeking wisdom, making observations, and endeavoring to answer tough questions in a way that will empower your family and your business. I'm Andy Andrews. Until next week, goodbye. This episode of The Professional Noticer was produced by Matt Limpert. The Noticer theme written and performed by Sugarcane Jane. Biofeedback for the cast and crew provided by Twinkle and Smoke of Beverly Hills. Additional funding provided by flavoredjavadreams.com. Are you tired of the same old morning routine, same old coffee taste to start your day? Oh, you say you're already into coffee flavors? Well, friend, we aren't talking about hazelnut or French vanilla. Those are so yesterday. FlavoredJavaDreams.com is now producing flavored coffee in the same manufacturing space as some of your favorite snack foods. So we're able to bring you a cornucopia of taste for the discriminating palate. Now, you can start your day with zesty ranch flavored coffee. Enjoy nacho cheese flavored brew at your coffee break and end your afternoon with wasabi coffee. When the day is done, sip a barbecue flavored decaf before bedtime. Commit to a year's monthly replenishment subscription today, and we'll include a month's supply of sour cream and onion coffee free of charge. That's flavoredjavadreams.com.